Okay, so today we're going to be looking closely at FEMA.
The Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Yeah, and thinking about like its future.
Its future, yeah, and the direction it's going in. We've got a lot of really interesting sources for this episode. We've pulled from a recent congressional hearing, some expert testimonies, and a few articles just to try to paint as complete of a picture as possible about the current state of FEMA and the discussions that are happening around it.
And if this is the kind of stuff you find interesting, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps us reach more people who care about these issues.
That's right. And what we really want to do today is sort of synthesize what we're seeing in all these sources, look for the key insights about the potential reforms FEMA might be facing and the pretty significant challenges that it's up against. And then, ultimately, what does this all mean for us? What does it mean for communities and how prepared we are for disasters?
Right, and I think a great place to start would be to look at some of those challenges, right? Like, let's just get that on the table right away. And one of the things that came up over and over again, especially in that Homeland Security Committee hearing transcript, was this idea of mission creep.
Yeah, mission creep. It's a concern that's been voiced that FEMA's responsibilities have expanded way beyond the original sort of idea of disaster relief.
Right, like it's not just about hurricanes and earthquakes anymore.
Right, exactly. So now, we see the agency involved in things like sheltering migrants, helping to resettle refugees, and the worry is that this broader scope is stretching the agency too thin, potentially diverting resources and personnel from its core mission. And that core mission really is about preparing for and responding to those major natural disasters that we've come to expect from FEMA. So, as they said during the hearing, is all this additional stuff, all these additional responsibilities, taking away from FEMA's ability to really focus on what it's supposed to be doing?
Right, I mean, it makes you wonder, if a hurricane hits and FEMA's resources are already stretched because they're dealing with all these other issues, how quickly and effectively can they respond to the disaster?
Exactly, and that's the concern, right? That when a major disaster hits, that FEMA may not be as prepared or as equipped as they should be. And so it's not just a bureaucratic issue, it's really something that could have a real impact on people's lives.
And it's not just the expanding mission either, right? There are also these questions that have come up about efficiency, about potential waste, the hearing transcript, and also I think there was a mention of a GAO report, the Government Accountability Office, that they highlighted some instances of money not being used properly. Particularly, I think there was a specific mention of the COVID-19 funeral assistance program.
Right. Yeah. The COVID-19 funeral assistance program was mentioned as an example where, approvals were given for duplicate applications, ineligible applications, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's like the money's there, but it's not always going to the right places or being used in the most effective way.
Right. And it's interesting because this concern about how FEMA operates, whether it's efficient enough, whether there's potential for waste, it's not a new thing. If you look back through the sources, it's this recurring theme, this feeling that maybe FEMA isn't as speedy or as consistent or as clear as it could be in how it does things. And the example of the Hurricane Milton incident that they talked about in the hearing, that really highlighted this need for FEMA to be completely impartial, completely focused on supporting all disaster survivors, regardless of, whatever else might be going on.
Right, and it's important to remember that these inefficiencies, they're not just, abstract problems. They can have real consequences. If there are delays in getting aid to people who need it after a disaster, that can impact their ability to recover. It can add to their stress. It can make a really tough situation even harder.
Exactly. So it's something that needs to be addressed, for the sake of the people that FEMA is supposed to be serving.
Absolutely. Now, another really critical area that came up in the sources is staffing. And this is something that I found particularly concerning because there seems to have been a trend towards reducing staff, even freezing funding for FEMA in certain areas. The ranking member during the hearing was pretty vocal about this, expressing a lot of concern about what they called reckless firings, the departure of experienced professionals. And there was even talk about potentially eliminating the agency altogether. I mean, that's a huge concern.
Yeah, and if you think about the implications of that, reducing staff, not having enough funding, the potential of the agency being eliminated, it really raises some big questions about how FEMA is going to be able to respond effectively to disasters in the future. As Mr. Manning, a former deputy administrator at FEMA, said in his testimony, the agency's strength is in its people. That's what makes it work. So if you're losing those experienced personnel, it's bound to have an effect on how decisions are made, how effectively they're carried out. And you have to ask yourself, if FEMA is facing these kind of staffing shortages, how quickly and how efficiently can they process aid applications? Can they coordinate the complex logistics of disaster response when a major event happens, in your region?
Right. I mean, it just seems like it's setting them up to be less effective, less responsive when they're needed most.
Exactly. And this whole issue of staffing really connects to another challenge that's been identified. And that is the growing reliance of state and local governments on FEMA.
Right. It seems like there's this expectation that FEMA is going to step in and handle everything,
Right.
which raises questions about whether that's a sustainable model in the long term.
Yeah, and this is a really important point. While FEMA does have a vital role to play, the fact that state and local governments are becoming more and more dependent on them, it does raise concerns. Are we doing enough to empower states and local communities to build up their own capacity for dealing with disasters, for being prepared, for responding effectively? Ideally, it should be a partnership. All levels of government should have clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and everyone should be actively contributing to making communities more resilient. If it becomes all about FEMA, if local and state entities just kind of wait for FEMA to show up, then that could potentially slow things down, right? It could hinder the development of those really tailored local solutions that might actually be the best fit for a particular community's risks.
Right. And it's important to remember that every community is different. They have their own unique vulnerabilities, their own unique needs when it comes to disaster preparedness and response.
Right. And that's why it's so crucial that we're not just relying on a one-size-fits-all approach, that we're empowering communities to really understand their own risks and develop strategies that are specific to their needs.
And speaking of risks, there's one huge one that we can't afford to ignore, and that's climate change. Both the FEMA challenges, opportunities, and pathways to reform excerpts in the hearing transcript, they both really emphasize the danger of not fully integrating climate change considerations into FEMA's planning.
Absolutely. I mean, as the climate changes, we're seeing more extreme weather events, more frequent disasters. And if we don't take that into account, if we're not planning for the future, the consequences could be pretty severe.
Right. I mean, Mr. Manning specifically pointed out that climate change is leading to storms that are more intense than we've seen in the past than historical data would suggest.
Right. And so if FEMA is relying on, outdated models, outdated assumptions, then they're not going to be prepared for what's coming. And this isn't just about, getting the numbers right. It's about making sure that infrastructure projects are designed to withstand those more intense storms. It's about making sure that communities are prepared to evacuate effectively if they need to. It's really about protecting lives and property in the face of a changing climate.
And to bring it even closer to home, think about your own community. Are the buildings designed to withstand the kind of extreme weather events that are becoming more likely because of climate change? Are there adequate evacuation plans in place? These are all questions that we need to be asking and addressing now before it's too late.
Yeah, and ignoring climate change in planning, it's not just a policy oversight. It's something that could have really tangible consequences for people's safety and their livelihoods.
Absolutely. And then, just to round out this picture of the challenges FEMA is facing, there were also mentions of the difficulties in coordinating logistics, especially when it comes to delivering assistance to island territories.
Right, and this really underscores the unique challenges faced by places that are, geographically isolated. When a disaster hits, getting aid to them can be really complicated. It can take longer, and that obviously has implications for how quickly people can start to recover.
Yeah, it's a reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to disaster management. We have to be mindful of the specific needs and challenges of different regions.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the challenges, sort of the difficulties that FEMA is up against. But let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about some of the innovative approaches that are being discussed, some of the potential solutions that are out there. And one that I found particularly interesting was community-based catastrophe insurance, or CBCI.
CBCI, yeah. That was something that popped up in a couple of the sources, especially the excerpt titled Community-Based Catastrophe Insurance, Enhancing Financial Resilience, and also into Mr. Kaniewski's testimony. They both presented it as this really promising way to improve financial resilience, but at a community level.
Right. So instead of just relying on individuals to get their own insurance, the idea with CBCI is that you create these insurance pools, these programs
Yeah.
that are tailored to a specific community's needs and risks.
And what I found interesting was that it seems to be pretty flexible, right? You
Yeah.
can cover a wide range of hazards like floods, wildfires, earthquakes, and even the definition of community can be pretty broad.
Yeah, that's one of the strengths of CBCI. A community could be a local government, it could be a neighborhood association, it could even be a business district. Essentially any entity that has the authority to secure insurance on behalf of multiple properties. So it's not just limited to, traditional geographic definitions of community.
Right? It's more about people coming together to share risk, which makes sense.
Exactly. And there are different models for how CBCI can work. Sometimes it's as simple as a community, helping their residents get access to affordable insurance. But sometimes it goes further than that. Communities can actually set up their own risk-bearing entities. And these are known as captive insure models, where they're actually taking on some of the risk themselves. So, it really depends on the community, what their needs are, what they're comfortable with.
And there are already some examples of CBCI in action, right? There was a mention of a pilot program in New York City that's aimed at helping low and moderate income households manage flood risk.
Yes, that's right. Mr. Koniewski specifically highlighted this pilot program. It's designed to help those vulnerable communities, those communities that might not have the resources to really prepare for a flood on their own. And the sources suggested that it would be really helpful if FEMA could clarify whether CBCI could be eligible for grant funding.
Oh, that's an interesting point because if communities knew that they could potentially access federal funds to support their CBCI programs, that would make it a lot more appealing,
Yeah.
right?
Right, exactly. And the other thing that they talked about was whether proceeds from parametric insurance policies, which are often used in CBCI, could count towards a state's public assistance matching requirements. This is getting a little bit into the weeds, but basically, if you're a state and you're applying for FEMA assistance after a disaster, you often have to put up some of your own money to match the federal funds.
Right, kind of like a copay.
Exactly. So the question is, if a community has a CBCI program that uses parametric insurance, could the payouts from those policies count towards that state match? Because if they could, that would be a huge incentive for states to encourage communities to adopt CBCI.
Right, it would make it more financially feasible for them.
Exactly. And parametric insurance is really interesting because it's different from traditional insurance. Traditional insurance, you have to, go through the whole process of assessing the damage, filing a claim. But with parametric insurance, it's much faster. It pays out based on predefined triggers. So, for example, if the wind speed in a hurricane reaches a certain level, the policy automatically pays out, regardless of the actual damage to your property.
So it's more about the intensity of the event, not the specific damage caused.
Right, exactly. And that makes it much faster to get money into the hands of people who need it after a disaster.
Yeah, that's really helpful in a situation where people are trying to recover and rebuild.
Right. Okay, so CBCI is just one example of the kind of innovative approaches that are being discussed when it comes to disaster management. And it really speaks to this broader point about FEMA's role in fostering resilience, in incentivizing action before disasters strike.
Right, and this is something that I found really interesting in the sources. There's this sense that FEMA could be doing more to proactively support state and local governments, not just stepping in after a disaster happens, but really helping them prepare beforehand.
Ari and Mr. Kaniewski used this great phrase. He talked about FEMA acting as risk advisors and stewards of a culture of resilience.
Yeah, I love that. It's like shifting the focus from just reacting to disasters to actually preventing them, or at least minimizing their impact.
Exactly. And, that might involve things like helping communities understand their risks, providing them with the tools and resources they need to develop effective mitigation strategies, really becoming a partner in preparedness.
And FEMA does already have some programs that are aimed at doing that, right? Like the preparedness grants, the hazard mitigation grant program. There was also mention of the BRIC program, building resilient infrastructure in communities, with a suggestion from Mr. Smitherman that maybe a portion of that funding should be redesigned to be more accessible to all states for capacity building.
Right. Those are all really important programs because they provide funding and resources to help communities invest in preparedness and mitigation. The preparedness grants, things like the Homeland Security Grant Program. That's really about building those foundational capabilities at the state and local level. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, that's specifically for projects that are aimed at reducing risk after a disaster has happened. And then BRIC, that's more about investing in large-scale infrastructure projects that can make communities more resilient. And Mr. Smitherman's suggestion about, making a portion of that BRIC funding more accessible for capacity building, that's really about making sure that all states have the resources they need to really think strategically about how to prepare for disasters.
Right, because preparedness is key. I mean, the more you can do to get ready for a disaster, the less the impact is going to be when it actually happens.
Exactly. But, it's not all about, positive incentives. The sources also pointed out that there are some FEMA programs that might actually be discouraging resilience, kind of unintentionally, of course. And the one that they really focused on was the Public Assistance Program, or PA.
Right, and this was mentioned in both Mr. Kaniewski's testimony and the flood insurance coverage excerpt. The issue seems to be with the minimum 75% reimbursement that the PA program offers for government infrastructure. It's like it's creating this kind of no-cost insurance for public entities, which maybe isn't such a good thing.
Right, because if you know that the federal government is going to cover 75% of the cost of rebuilding a damaged road or a bridge or a public building, you might be less inclined to invest in making that infrastructure more resilient in the first place, right?
Right.
Why spend the extra money if you know you're going to get reimbursed anyway?
Right. So it's like it's disincentivizing them from taking those proactive steps that could actually save money and reduce risk in the long run.
Exactly. And they mentioned the example of Category E costs, which cover public buildings and contents. That's a huge area of expenditure for FEMA.
And there's also this idea that's been floated around in the past about creating a disaster deductible.
Yeah, like a deductible that you would have with your car insurance or your health insurance. The idea is that if governments had to pay a portion of the cost of disaster recovery up front, it would encourage them to be more careful about managing risk.
Right. It would give them more skin in the game.
Exactly. And this whole issue of incentives and disincentives, it doesn't just apply to governments, it also applies to individuals.
Right, because there's this perception out there that FEMA is going to come in and make you whole after a disaster.
Yeah, and as Mr. Kaniewski and the flood insurance coverage excerpt both pointed out, that's a misconception. FEMA assistance is really meant to help you get back on your feet, to provide some basic support. It's not meant to replace insurance. But because of this misconception, a lot of people don't bother getting flood insurance.
Right, they figure that FEMA will just take care of everything, which is a risky assumption.
It is, and it can lead to some pretty significant financial hardship for people if they're not prepared. And this whole issue of flood insurance, it's a really important one because flooding is involved in almost all natural disasters.
Yeah, it's not just about hurricanes and coastal storms. You can have flooding from heavy rains, from overflowing rivers, from dam failures.
Exactly. And so having adequate flood insurance is critical, but as we've discussed, the coverage rates are really low.
Right, and there are a lot of reasons for that. There are issues with affordability, there's limited risk awareness, sometimes people just don't understand how flood insurance works, and then there's this belief that FEMA is going to step in and cover everything.
Right, and all of that contributes to this situation where, when a major flood hits a community, a lot of people are left without the financial resources they need to recover.
And the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP,
Yeah.
that's the main source of flood insurance for most people. But it's also facing a lot of challenges, right? Like significant debt, for example.
Yeah, the NFIP has been in debt for quite a while, and they've been trying to reform the program to make it more financially sound. One of the recent efforts was called Risk Rating 2.0, which was designed to make premiums more reflective of the actual risk that a particular property faces.
Right. So instead of everyone paying the same rate, people who live in higher risk areas would pay more, and people in lower risk areas would pay less.
Exactly. But, there's always a concern that when you start adjusting premiums based on risk, it could make flood insurance unaffordable for some people.
Right. So that's something that needs to be carefully considered.
Absolutely. And then, beyond the NFIP, there's this whole discussion about the need to grow the private flood insurance market. Right now, the NFIP is really the only game in town for most people. But if we could encourage more private insurers to offer flood coverage, that would give consumers more options. It would potentially make flood insurance more affordable, and it would reduce the financial burden on the NFIP.
Right. It would create more competition, which is usually a good thing.
Exactly. And then there are also some really innovative approaches being explored, like parametric insurance, which we talked about earlier, which could potentially streamline the process of getting payouts to people after a flood.
Yeah, that's a really promising area.
It is. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention the community rating system.
CRS, yeah,
Yeah.
that's an interesting program.
It is. It's a voluntary program that's part of the NFIP, and it basically rewards communities that go above and beyond the minimum requirements for floodplain management. So if a community takes steps to reduce flood risk, like improving their drainage systems or adopting stricter building codes, they can earn points. And those points translate into discounts on flood insurance premiums for everyone in the community.
So it's a great example of how incentivizing good behavior can really benefit everyone.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges FEMA is facing. We've talked about some of the innovative approaches that are being considered. But what about the bigger picture? What are some of the broader perspectives on FEMA reform that emerged from the sources?
Well, there's a pretty clear consensus that FEMA needs a serious overhaul. The FEMA challenges, opportunities, and pathways to reform. Excerpts, Carrie Spranz's testimony, they both stress the need for a comprehensive review and reform of the agency. And a lot of people think that it's time to update the Stafford Act, which is really the foundational law that governs how FEMA operates.
Right, because the Stafford Act was written a while ago, and the world has changed a lot since then. We have new challenges, new technologies, new ways of thinking about disaster management.
Exactly. So the argument is that the Stafford Act needs to be modernized to reflect those changes. And then there's this other idea that's been floated around, which is to make FEMA an independent agency again.
Oh, interesting. So take it out of the Department of Homeland Security and make it its own standalone entity.
Right. And the thinking there is that it would streamline FEMA's focus, it would reduce bureaucracy, it would allow the agency to be more nimble and responsive. Now, whether that's actually the best solution, it's still up for debate, but it's definitely an idea that's out there.
And another thing that came up repeatedly was the importance of clearly defining roles and responsibilities for all the different partners involved in disaster management. You've got local governments, state governments, federal agencies, tribal governments, nonprofits, private sector companies. Everyone plays a role.
Right. It's a complex ecosystem. And if everyone's not on the same page, if it's not clear who's responsible for what, then it can lead to confusion, duplication of effort, delays in getting aid to people who need it.
Right. And Mr. Smitherman highlighted the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, EMAC, as a really valuable framework for state-to-state mutual aid.
Yeah, EMAC is basically an agreement that allows states to share resources and personnel during emergencies. So if one state is overwhelmed by a disaster, other states can step in and provide support. And that kind of cooperation is really essential because disasters don't respect state lines.
Right. A hurricane can hit multiple states. A wildfire can spread across state borders.
Exactly. And Carrie Speranza made a really important point about any reform efforts needing to have transparent methodology and financial controls, especially if we're talking about shifting towards block grants or decentralizing responsibilities.
Right. Because with block grants, you're basically giving states more flexibility in how they use the money, but you also need to make sure that there's accountability, that the money is being used effectively and for its intended purpose.
Exactly. And she also stressed the need for a mandatory minimum pass-through of funds to the jurisdictions that are directly affected by a disaster.
So that the money is actually reaching the communities that need it most.
Right. And, there was also a discussion about the specific challenges that non-continental U.S. jurisdictions face, places like Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, American Samoa. Mr. Hernandez brought this up during the hearing. Mr. Smitherman acknowledged that if FEMA was decentralized, if there was more emphasis on state and local control, that those jurisdictions could potentially be disadvantaged.
Right, because they're so geographically isolated, they rely more heavily on federal assistance.
Exactly. And so there needs to be some careful consideration about how to ensure that those jurisdictions get the support they need, regardless of how FEMA is structured.
Right, and then there was also some talk about potential waste and inefficiency in federal disaster spending.
Yeah, that's always a concern, right? Making sure that taxpayer dollars are being used wisely and effectively. Mr. Breen and Mr. Smitherman both touched on this during the hearing, and it's definitely something that needs to be addressed in any reform efforts.
Absolutely. And then finally, there was this really strong emphasis on the importance of FEMA's workforce. Both Mr. Manning and the ranking member during the hearing talked about how critical it is to have experienced and dedicated professionals at FEMA. And they expressed a lot of concern about the impact of staff firings and funding freezes on the agency's ability to do its job effectively.
Right, because ultimately FEMA is only as good as the people who work there.
Okay, so to sum up what we've talked about today, FEMA is facing some pretty significant challenges. There's this issue of mission creep, concerns about efficiency and waste, staffing problems, the increasing demands of climate change, the unique needs of different regions.
But despite all of that, FEMA remains a vital part of our national disaster management system.
Right, and there are a lot of really important discussions happening right now about how to reform FEMA, how to make it more effective, more resilient, more responsive to the needs of communities.
And some of the ideas that are being considered, things like community-based catastrophe insurance, a greater emphasis on pre-disaster mitigation, a more clearly defined role for all the different partners involved in disaster management, these are all really promising developments.
And it's important to remember that disaster preparedness and response, it's not just the responsibility of the federal government. It's something that we all need to be thinking about at the individual level, at the community level, at the state level.
Right. So here's a final thought for you to consider. What can you do in your own life, in your own community, to build greater resilience? How can you become more informed and engaged in advocating for effective disaster management policies? Maybe start by exploring your local and state emergency management agencies, understand what they're doing, how they're preparing for disasters. Knowledge is power, and the more we all understand about the risks we face and the actions we can take to mitigate them, the safer and more resilient our communities will be.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.